Yo, what's up guys? Today I wanted to do a deck profile for Nami. This is a super fun deck. If you haven't had a chance to try it out, it's a lot of fun. It's very difficult to play, so I'm going to try to not just give you the deck profile, but some strategies, combos, and kind of what you're looking to do just to help you guys out a little bit, because it is extremely crazy hard to play this deck, but it's very rewarding when it works. It works really well. So before we get started in the video, of course, leave a like, a sub, comment down below what you guys want to see next. And yeah, let's go ahead and dive into it. One quick thing before we start, I also wanted to mention you should always go second with this deck. It just makes sense. The win condition is to get to 0 cards. So starting the game with 39 instead of 40 just makes the win condition easier to get. So yeah, if possible, always go second with this deck. So let's get into it. We start with 4 copies of Buggy the Clown. This is a very simple card. You summon him, you get an Impel Down card to your hand, and then you can rearrange the other 4 cards and put it at the bottom of the deck, which is very important because every game really does come down to the last couple of cards, whatever those are in your deck. So when you use your Buggy, it's very important that you understand like how to rearrange the deck properly. So for example, if you had like a Pot of Greed as one of those cards that you're sending to the bottom of the deck, it makes a lot of sense to have the Pot of Greed and then 2 other cards beneath the Pot of Greed. So in other words, if you get to that card right here, which would be the Pot of Greed, then you can use it and immediately draw those last 2 remaining and just win. The same can go for a couple of other cards as well, such as the Gavel, because then you use that and then you discard or mill and then you just win the game, right? So understanding what you want to have and what order you want to have is very important with this deck. So Buggy is pretty good. You want to use it to, of course, just, get another card out of your deck as well and help keep your hand size healthy. So it's also pretty good because the 2k attack means you can attack an Ezo, for example. You won't really be able to kill another Buggy though because he is a slash type, but you have a little bit of utility to use him against like Makino and Ezo and things like that. Don't be afraid to attack with him. So yeah, Buggy, a very good card. Always try to remember what those bottom cards are. They do come up a lot. We have 4 copies of Mr. One or Das Bones. This is an Impel Down card that allows you to get 1 blue event with a cost of 1 out of your graveyard and into your hand. Ideally, you will be using this for more copies of Usopp Rubber Band of Doom or more copies of Gavel, because you want to be able to reuse and use those as much as possible to protect yourself and mill more cards. So obviously, this is a great target for you to get with Buggy, an extremely good card. Next up, we have 2 copies of Gum Gum Rain. This is a counter that requires a cost. You have to discard 1 card in your hand to gain 3k power. The upside, it is a Impel Down card, which is really good. It has 0 cost, so it's an extremely good counter in the early game, especially against good opponents. So one of the biggest reasons why, let's pretend this is an enemy leader. A good enemy leader against a Nami player, they will attack for 7k with 2 Dawn every single turn. Of course, it's even worse if it's like Katakuri, because then they can just attack 7 with 1 Dawn every turn. It is a very tough matchup for you to deal with. But ideally, being able to counter out of it with a Gum Gum Rain or a Gavel is extremely good, and that's why it's in there. And having to discard a card is honestly not all that bad, because we'll get into it actually right here. The next card is 4 copies of Impel Down All-Stars. Now, this is basically the card that you're going to get as a last resort with Buggy. You don't really want to get this, but if you can, it is something you can get. And ideally, you will be using it simply as a cost for your Gum Gum Rain and for your Gavel. Now, the only reason this is in the deck is because, 1, it's just one of those things you can grab with Buggy, but really, the trigger is the best part. The trigger is draw 2 cards. It turns into a Pot of Greed if it is in your life. So one very important thing when you're looking for your mulligan, you want to make sure this card is not in your hand, because if it's not in your hand, the chances are that it's in your life is a bit higher. And this is an extremely good card when it's in your life. You can use the trigger, get 2 cards. It's great. But ideally, the only other thing that you will be doing with this card is basically just using it as the cost. There is one small play that I did do with it. It's very specific, but I guess I can mention it. If you're playing against a CP9 or just any Navy deck in general, there is a chance that they have Fujitora. If you don't know, Fujitora discards 2 random cards in your hand if you have 6 or more. In a Nami deck, it is pretty likely that you will have 6 or more cards. So you can actually just activate this for 1 Dawn, use the effect to trash 1 or 2 cards, or just use the effect and put it in the grave, because it is an optional effect. It's not mandatory. So you could just ditch it if that's the 6th card, put it to the graveyard. Now you have 5 cards in your hand, so when you pass the turn, Fujitora doesn't discard 2. So that is kind of a small little thing that you can do. Keep that in mind if you're playing against a Navy player. Fujitora is out there. It is really good, I would say, probably the best counter to you. So definitely watch out for that. Next up, we have 2 copies of Brick Fist. This is an Impel Down card that allows you to return a cost of 4 or less to the hand. This is really good against 6k beat sticks, the vanillas that a lot of people run, such as Whitebeard runs Atmos, for example, and there's some Big Mom ones as well. So yeah, this is a pretty good card. One of the things that you can do with it, though, that is really good that I like is you can use it on your own cards, so you can use their effects multiple times. This comes into play especially when you have a copy of Kaya. And we will talk a lot about Kaya at the end. That's kind of why I'm keeping these cards all out here. Next up, we have 4 copies of Deathwing. This is an extremely good card. However, I don't like to keep too many copies of this in my hand, and I actually have no problem using it as a cost for Rain or Gavel, typically because you want to use Deathwink once. So if you have 2 copies of Deathwink in your hand, you're not just going to use 3 Dawn and then draw 1 and then have another 3. Like, that's 6 Dawn to draw 2 cards. It's not that efficient. Deathwink is at its best when you have only 1 copy of it in your hand and you use the 3 to draw 2. So if you have multiple copies of Deathwink, I have no problem getting rid of one of those for a Rain cost or a Gavel cost. So keep that in mind. It's probably the most efficient way to do it. An extremely good card, though, because it has that 6k power, which is pretty handy, honestly. Against bigger swings, this is the card that you want in the late game. If you're trying to play the deck aggressively, by aggressively, I mean if the enemy is attacking your life, you want to use all of your resources and Dawn to counter out of that aggressively. That way, so you can use the Deathwing. Because at the beginning of the game, you're probably going to be using a lot of things like Kaya and Buggy and things that get you cards to your hand. You know, Das Bones is another one. And by doing that, you're going to get, 5, 6 cards plus, which means you're probably never going to use the Deathwing. However, once the attacks start coming in on your life, that's when you use all of these counters aggressively. Your hand size will go down, and then that's when the Deathwing, you get your resources back. Ideally, that's what you're trying to do, right? So anyways, 4 copies of Deathwing, a really good card. Try to counter out aggressively to work towards the Deathwing. Next up, we have 4 copies of Kaya. This is basically the best card in the deck. I mean, you want to use this as much as possible. And you have a lot of cards that allow you to bounce her back to your hand as well, and that is something that you're trying to do. You use her to draw 2, trash 2, and the whole purpose of that is you're just thinning your deck. So a lot of the things that you want to do with Kaya is you want to summon her and then return her back to your hand with Brick Fist, as well as things like Overheat, which we will get into, and as well as Zeph, who is also in here as well, because we have 4 copies of him, and 1 very cool alt art version as well. So Zephin is an extremely good card because you're able to bounce the Kaya back to your hand. There are other good targets. You could, of course, do Buggy and Das Bones. I really like the Das Bones one over Buggy, and then you can mill 2. The problem with Zeph is getting in the hit on life on him. Ideally, you want to be able to attack an enemy and mill 7, but that's probably not going to happen in this meta because everybody is playing Whitebeard. I mean, Whitebeard is the best deck, and Whitebeard has so many counters in his hand, and so many things like Rad Beam and Guard Point, you're probably never going to get a Zeph attack out. It's just not going to happen. So ideally, you play the Zeph, and you use the effect to get the Kaya back and mill 2. That's what you're trying to do. So that's why you have Zeph in there. And every other match, you can get a hit in on life, and it's so good, right? Like, I put, 4 Dawn on him, attack for, 9 or 10k, right? And that's how you do it. Ideally, if you attack for 7, the enemy's just going to counter out of it. You have to swing big with Zeph in order for it to connect. Otherwise, they're just going to kill it. And obviously, if you're playing against yellow, they're probably just going to Thunderbolt it. So make sure to just always have a good bounce target when you use Zeph. Next up, we have 4 Gavels. This is the main event card that you want to use. One of the biggest things that you need to worry about is it only works on your leader. So that's kind of one of the big downsides to this. Usopp Rubber Band of Doom allows you to protect a character like Zeph. So if you attack with Zeph, you can use Rubber Band of Doom to kind of protect him. And it makes it easier because he's 6k instead of 5. So that means it's pretty easy to kind of counter out of those attacks normally. But Gavel only affects your leader. That's the problem with that. You do have to discard for cost, and one of the other cards, other than Impel Down, All-Stars, and Deathwink, of course, would be the Zeph, because you're not going to really use Zeph multiple times. So discarding a Zeph as cost is also very reasonable, because you're probably only going to use one Zeph a game. So discard the other ones, it's completely fine. Next up, the other really amazing counter that you run 4 of, Usopp Rubber Band of Doom. This is a 2k counter, so a lot of good players will always attack for 7, and you're not going to be able to get the actual really good value out of it. But of course, it's a lot better to use this early on over Gavel, because you don't have a cost, you don't have to discard a card in order to use it. And of course, you can use it on your characters, such as Zeph. So it's really good, and you want to be able to recycle and use this as much as possible. But if the enemy kind of knows what they're doing and they're attacking for 7 every turn, then this card gets a little bit worse. So keep that in mind. Maybe the Gavel is better than... This is like what I prefer, because this helps you keep the card advantage in your hand. But if you're playing against a good player, you're just going to have to go for the Gavel over the Usopp Rubber Band of Doom, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Also, use this trigger as often as you can if you get it. It's a really good trigger. Draw a card, then mill a card. So yeah, pretty good. Next up, we have Desert Spada. This is kind of a weaker option to use. It's not exactly the best event. It's just a 2k counter. However, you can stack 3 cards on the top of your deck. It's not bad. Generally, you can also put them to the bottom if you get cards like this at the top and you're like, okay, well, I can't use these cards right now. Just put it to the bottom, right? But the main reason this is in here is just because the trigger is really, really good. You get to draw 2 cards. So basically, it's like a Pot of Greed in the trigger or this in the trigger. It's really what you want to have in your life more than anything else. And it's not a very good target with Bones. It's also a reasonable thing to discard with your Gavel or Gum Gum Rain, in my opinion. I have no problem getting rid of the Desert Spadas. Using it for a 2k counter if you have to, it's fine. But in general, it's kind of just there because the trigger is good. It's an okay option for Bones. I mean, yeah, it's all right. It's not a super good card. If you take it down to 3, I would totally understand where you're coming from. But if you do get it in your life, it's amazing, right? But same thing with this. So yeah, that's okay. Just discard it with Gum Gum Rain or Gavel. It's not that big of a deal. And then we have 3 Overheats. This is a very good card because it allows you to bounce not just an enemy card to the hand, but allows you to bounce the Kaya back to your hand. Kind of what your dream opening hand would be to have these 2 cards in your starting hand. So you use the Kaya, and the next turn you overheat the Kaya back to your hand, and then you can use it again, and then eventually you could like Brick Fist another Kaya. So that's kind of what you're looking to do. You want to use Kaya, then overheat Kaya, Brick Fist Kaya, and then Zeph the Kaya. I mean, if you use Kaya 3 times, that's like 6 cards that you get to mill. So it's really good. Yeah, that's what you're trying to do with this deck. Most of the time, you're trying to just keep bouncing Kaya back to your hand as much as possible. If you wanted to add a 4th overheat, I would totally get that. I actually am considering it as well. Personally, though, instead of getting rid of a Desert Spada, I've actually even thought about getting rid of 1 Zeph because I only use Zeph once per game. 4 is in there because I just want to be able to see him, but I could see myself actually going 3 Zeph, 4 overheat pretty easily. Next up, we have 3 Love Beams. Super good card, right? The big downside to this card, though, is that you have to have 3 in your hand for it to be used. And sometimes it's really difficult to get down to that. So you actually have to play pretty patiently. And sometimes I even use this as a cost for Gum Gum Rain and Gavel because you just have to. It's more important. Instead of trying to draw the card and being greedy to get that 1 card, it might just be better to use it as a cost to save yourself from a hit in order for you not to get a life taken. That's generally better. The big downside I have with this card is there's no trigger. So like you've noticed, there's a lot of triggers in this deck. Pretty much every single event in this has a trigger that is useful, right? Draw 2 cards, be able to bounce something for free, bounce a 7, you know, draw 2, draw 1, bounce something with Gum Gum Rain and Gavel, which means you can bounce like a Kaya. It's really good. Not having a trigger is actually why I don't like having this at 4, and I can even see myself going down to 2. But it is a really good card in the mid to late stage of the game. And then lastly, we have, of course, the best card in the deck, 4 copies of Pot of Greed. Draw 2, trigger, draw 2. It's just self-explanatory. The biggest problem that I have with this card is that it costs 3 to use, which is actually kind of a big problem because you use that, and having 3 Dawn in the early game is not good. Late game, when you have, 8 or 10 Dawn, it's fine. But having that 3 Dawn and using it in the early game really sucks. You kind of want to save it for an overheat or something else. So yeah, sometimes using a Pilaf on curve might seem like the right play, but it's not. You need to have the Dawn in order to save your life. You need to counter out of it. So try to save this until the late stages of the game where you can squeeze a Pot of Greed in and then be able to do other things. You don't just want to be like, all right, turn 2, Pot of Greed, and then I have no other play. Probably not that good. So all around, this is the very standard version of the deck. This is the Impel Down event-based version. There are other ways you can play this deck. There are character-heavy versions, but like I said before, with Zeph, you're probably not going to be able to get a hit in on the enemy's life, especially against a Whitebeard. So why would you play the character version? Those characters are never going to be able to hit the enemy life. Like a Bellamere, the best value she's going to get for you is if she dies, so you can mill 3. Right? So yeah, that's just something that I think personally. I think there are some ways to spice the deck up, and I am researching it as well. However, I'm going to have to do a bit more play testing before we get to that. But this is the deck, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Maybe in the comments, let me know what you guys want to see next so I can start working on it. But otherwise, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you all have a good one. Peace.